I'm sure all of us is familiar with the story of Joseph. We've been going to the life of Joseph, right? And typically, if you would follow that story, the highlight of that life is Genesis chapter 41. That's the passage we're looking at today. Wherein Joseph was automatically or immediately transformed into the second most powerful person in Egypt. Second to Pharaoh. Today's message is entitled The Big Payoff Day. Is it? Desiring after God. Is this really the big payoff day in the story of Joseph? I mean, what a difference a day make. You wake up one morning, you're Joseph, and you're in your clothes, your prison clothes, doing your prison duties. It's your ordinary day, nothing special. 2 years has passed, and you realize that the cupbearer has forgotten you. Your only hope for deliverance from the pit, from the dungeons, and from prison is long gone. You don't hear any word from the cupbearer. Yet all of a sudden, one of the guards rushes in and says, "Hurry up, hurry up. Dress up. Pharaoh is summoning you." What? All of a sudden, he was shaved. His hair was bald. And they were running, going now to Pharaoh. Your faithfulness has now been rewarded. And this is the typical theme. This is the typical story you hear in preaching on Joseph. Remain faithful to God. Because here, Joseph was faithful for 20 years. He was 20 years in prison already. He was faithful to God and nothing's happening. And today is the big payoff day. I'm being called by Pharaoh. Genesis 41 verse 1 says, "Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. And behold, he was standing by the Nile." Typically, pharaohs, they do have royal dreams. Because they believe that they have a special bond with the gods. In fact, they were the representative of the gods. That's why people, they bow down, they worship Pharaoh. And the Nile was very important. So, because in the Nile, that's the source of their existence. In Egypt, they don't rely on rainfall to sustain the crops. They rely on the flooding of the Nile, which happens every year. So those are the things at play here. Verse 2, "And lo, from the Nile there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass." That scenery of the cow coming out of the Nile River is not unusual. Because typically the cows do submerge themselves during the heat. And they would lie there. And when their body are cooled off, they would rise. And they would graze. Verse 3, "Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and gaunt. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek fat cows. Then Pharaoh awoke. He fell asleep again and dreamed a second dream. And behold, 70 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plumful ears. Then Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now in the morning his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. I mean, Pharaoh had a dream, and to him it made no sense. Typically, a Pharaoh should be able to interpret dreams. Why? Because they're divine. They have a special connection to the gods. If there's anyone who could interpret a dream, it's them. But here, he realized he cannot. There was no rhyme, there's no reason for this dream to find meaning. And all his wise men could not even interpret the dream. That's why it was so bothersome for Pharaoh. He was so troubled with that dream. Verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I would make mention today of my own offense. This was the cue that Joseph has been waiting for. The cupbearer remembering him. But you will note, the cupbearer said, I will make mention today of my offenses. The cupbearer realized he had 2 offenses. The first offense was to Joseph, forgetting him. And the second offense was to Pharaoh, for not speaking up early enough to tell him that yes, there is this Hebrew slave who can interpret dreams. Verse 10. Pharaoh was furious with his servant, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captains of the bodyguard, which we know is Potiphar, both me and the chief baker. We had a dream the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Verse 12. Now a Hebrew youth was with us there, a servant of the captain of the bodyguard, and we related them to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each one he interpreted according to his own dreams. And just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me in my office, but he hanged him. Verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent out and called for Jacob, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. What that means is they rushed him immediately. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Yeah. Interesting. Whenever there's a major thing happening to Joseph, it involves his garment. Remember, his dad gave him a multicolored coat. That became the source of jealousy. And remember when and brought him into the jail of brought him to the house of Potiphar. And in the house of Potiphar, the wife wanted to make advances and would use his garments as proof that he was trying to be raped. And that brought him to jail under the house of Potiphar. And there he met. And now, the turn of events, he's now being put on new clothes. Verse 15. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had the dream, but no one can interpret it. I tried the magicians, I tried the wise men, not one of them can explain what happened to my dream, the meaning of my dream. And I have heard it said about you that when you hear of a dream, you can interpret it. You know, the cupbearer gave a good account on Joseph. As I mentioned, the cupbearer was very influential. He's the one that checks the cup, whatever the Pharaoh drinks, that there's no poison. So when the cupbearer gave that recommendation, Pharaoh believed because the cupbearer was one of the most trusted person of Pharaoh. His life depended on him. So that's why I heard about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I mean, Joseph could be easily tempted to promote himself. He could have easily said, yeah, I'm that guy. I'm indispensable to you right now. I'm important and you know it. But instead, what Joseph did is he corrected Pharaoh. He said in verse 16, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Joseph's confidence was in God, and he humbly depended on Him. He did not promote himself. He wanted to point people to the real source of his ability. He has no room for self-promotion or boasting. Diba it's so easy to promote yourself in this position, to say, yeah, I'm good. You need me. I'm smart, I can help you with your problems. But Joseph realized, no, it was all from God. Because boasting, when we boast, we reveal something in our hearts. It shows that we don't give credit to God for the abilities that He has given us. That's why you boast about yourself. And when we boast, we want to impress other people rather than impress God. We want to ensure that other people knows your accomplishments. We want other people know how rich you are, how well connected you are, simply because your audience is other people and not God. And we try to get our emotional and physical needs satisfied by other people's affirmation of your statement. But if you remember that God is your audience, and God is the one your life is meant for, you will be content to be in the shadows of God, pointing every accolade to Him. For He is the source of all things. John 3:30 says, "He must increase, but I must decrease." There is no boasting in the man of God, no matter how successful you are. The Bible says in Exodus, all wealth comes from the Lord. Everything is the Lord's. Your ability is the Lord's. But the problem with us is that we want to boast about ourselves, our achievement, what we have done. We want people to be at awe with us. I cringe whenever I hear testimonies of people about their great worldly successes. And in the end, they say, praise God. But the people, the audience are impressed with the guy, not with his God. We can easily cloak our boastfulness with Christian words around it. Joseph had nothing to do with that shenanigan and charade. He realized everything is from God. He is content to be working at the shadows of God. There's no boasting. Verse 17, so Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, in my dream, behold, I was standing at the banks of the Nile, and behold, 7 cows, fat, sleek, came up out of the Nile, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Lo, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such I had never seen, for ugliness in all of the land of Egypt. Very ugly cows. And the lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. 21. Yet when they have devoured them, it could not be detected that they have devoured them, for they were just as ugly as before. Then I awoke. I saw also my dream. Behold, 7 ears full of good came out of a single stalk. And lo, 7 ears withered, thin, and scourged by the east wind, sprouted up after them. And the thin ears swallowed the 7 good ears. Then I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it. He recounted the dream. As I told you, the Nile River was their source of life. And they believed that the gods that control the Nile River are powerful gods. What made this dream disturbing? It's so unusual. Normally when there is a bad dream, it's just a bad dream. When there's a good dream, it's just a good dream. And normally, if there's a bad dream, there is a cause. Oh, you did this, that's why there's a curse on you. In this story, there's both a good dream and a bad dream. The good dream is the 7 fat cows and the stock that's bountiful. The bad dream is the ugly cows and the stock that is thin and withered. And there was no offense expressed why this is happening. So here, Joseph now interprets the dream for Pharaoh. Verse 25. Now Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream are one and the same. God has told to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Then 7 good cows are the 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one and the same. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after they are 7 years, and the 7 years thin ears scourged by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is as I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great abundance are coming in all the land of Egypt, and after them 7 years of famine will come, and all the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land. So the abundance will be unknown in the land because of the subsequent famine, for it will be very severe. Now as for the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it means that the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. Giving that interpretation to Pharaoh requires boldness. Because, Pharaoh, as I told you, has a strong relationship with God. In fact, they believe that the Pharaoh has powers to balance the natural forces, to ensure peace and prosperity in Egypt. They were there to mediate and control the weather, the outcomes of things. Because they have a malakas connection nila kay God. They have a strong connection with God. But here, Joseph exposes Pharaoh that he has no ability in controlling the future and could not provide for his people in times of famine. And it was God who is in control. It is God who will determine. It is God who controls the future, the economies of Egypt, and the life of every people there. Because Joseph said, God will make this come to pass. This will happen certainly because of God's design. Not because of Pharaoh. Not because of your gods. Verse 33. Now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. I mean, this is a logical consequence of the dream's interpretation. But again, it was risky for Joseph to give unsolicited advice. This was unsolicited. There, he was just asking the interpretation, but not the solution. But Joseph took the initiative. 34, let Pharaoh take action to appoint an overseer in charge of the land, and let him exact a fifth of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grains for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and let them guard it. Let the food become a reserve for the land for 7 years of famine, which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish during the famine. So again, Joseph elaborates his unsolicited advice, and his advice was kind of attractive to the government in the sense that there is now a strategy on how to mitigate the threat of a famine. And the strategy was to tax the people with grains. 20%. And when the famine comes, guess what? They will sell that very grain to the people that donated them. And when they have no more money to pay and buy the grain, the government can now get their land. Very good strategy. You ask for donation, that same donation will be used to sell to you. Oh, they're very nice. Right? It was a superb strategy. That's why in 37, now the proposal seems good to Pharaoh and all his servants. It might not be popular to the populace, but it gained the nod of Pharaoh. In fact, he says in 38, then Pharaoh said to the servant, can we find a man like this, in whom is a divine spirit? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Imagine how powerful that is. Alas, Joseph is being rewarded. God is now rewarding him with fame, fortune, and family for being faithful. Thus, all of us should hang on there, because one day, the big payoff. Like Joseph, we will be rewarded. We will be recognized. Verse 42. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him with a garment of fine linen, and put gold necklace around his neck. He had him ride in the second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, bow the knee. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. He is now the second most powerful man. Everything that he says goes. In fact, the very signet ring, the royal seal bearer, was given to Joseph. That means whenever there's a contract that needs to be signed, if If Joseph puts his mark there, it's as good as Pharaoh giving his approval. Most influential person in the most powerful nation. The linen robe and the gold chain showed his status and rank of his office. The chariot that was given to him shows it's like a limousine. The people that was going ahead of him, they're like now the Secret Service protecting. People bowing down to him, he's treated almost like a god, like Pharaoh. What more can you ask for? 44. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Jacob, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission no one shall rise his hand or foot in the land of Egypt. It's almost like saying, though I am the boss, you're the boss. How powerful is that? Then Pharaoh named Joseph Zaphtena Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. The name given to him was Zaphtena Paneah. People aren't sure what that really means. Some says God speaks and lives. Question is, which God? But the wife given to Joseph was Asenath, which means what? She belongs to the goddess Nath. And the father is the priest of On. The priest of On is one of the most powerful priests during that time. They oversee the festivals and festivities, and they were in charge of all of the priests. There was only one priest higher than him. For short, Joseph was married into nobility. Wow. I was watching a show. If I'm not mistaken, yes. The Europeans, I don't remember what century, were becoming poor. What they did was, and the Americans wanted to become more notable. So what they did was, the Europeans tried marrying rich Americans so that the rich Americans would fund the poor royal families. In turn, the Americans would get the prestige of dining and wining with kings and princes and dukes and duchesses. Joseph was married into one of the most powerful families in Egypt. Not to mention he's the second most powerful guy. And married into the second most powerful priest family. It's a marriage, a powerhouse marriage. And what does this show us? Joseph is now totally Egyptianized. He looks like an Egyptian, bald head, right? He dresses like an Egyptian. His wife is an Egyptian. All the trappings of an Egyptian elite was with him. In fact, he looks so much like an Egyptian that when he was faced with his brothers did not recognize him. You know, recently I saw a friend of mine. A friend of mine that I haven't seen for maybe more than 30 years. I recognize him. He looks old.
Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I said, I'm sure he thinks I look old too. So, I didn't say hi. But this, no, I know that guy. I recognize him. Despite not seeing him for 30 plus years. Here, the brother did not recognize. He was so Egyptianized that he was unrecognizable. Verse 46. Now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of plenty, the land brought forth abundance. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years, which according to the land of Egypt, and placed in the food in the cities. He placed every city the food from its surrounding fields. Thus Joseph stored up grains in great abundance, like the sand of the seas. And he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. Everything transpired exactly as Joseph has said. Egypt now has a stockpile of grains like the sand of the sea. So much that they stopped counting how much they had. Not only does Egypt have enough grains, they have enough grains for even other countries around to buy from them. What a great story. Be faithful and God will reward you. From pit to the palace. From a nobody in jail to a somebody in the courts of Pharaoh. From being powerless, now you are the second most powerful. The contrast cannot be more poles apart. Indeed, this is the big payoff for Joseph's faithfulness. Faithfulness will be rewarded with fame, fortune, and family. What more can we ask? But I believe that is the wrong understanding of the passage. But to get the right understanding of the passage, we have to understand the passage in terms of the redemptive story of land, seed, and covenant. Let me tell you a story. There's this lady, a mother. Let's call her Helen. He had a Christian son. Let's call him Christian. The thing is, with this Christian, his son named Christian, he had a problematic life in the sense that she's now always on her knees praying. In fact, she frequently goes to church and asks the elders there to pray for his son. Christian was a talented, handsome young lad. He went to the best university, got a degree, landed a great job. Whatever he touches turns into gold. There are guys who are like that. All the business they entered into, success. All the assignment that they are told to do becomes a hit. But like any corporate jobs, there was a price to pay for Christian. Christian worked for a company that has a moral reputation less than desirable. Not only that, his job moved him far away from his family. He was assigned abroad. There, he never went to church. Never saw his family again, not even on holidays. Eventually, he chose a different name. Nobody knew him as Christian. He was called Darwin because he was able to thrive under the survival of the fittest of this corporate jungle wherein dog eats dog. Eventually, Christian married. Unfortunately, he married an unbeliever. It was a shotgun marriage. The granddaughter of the founder of the company. What can you do? The couple had kids, but Helen never got to see them. She never got a picture of his grandsons. She did not know, however, that the sons in the family, she did know that her son and his family never entered or attended church. Needless to say, Helen was devastated. That's why she was in her knees. Did you notice the elements of that story? It's exactly Genesis chapter 41. How on earth can that be the crowning glory of the story of Joseph? How on earth can that be the big payoff day? This is what prosperity gospel tells us. Be faithful to God and He will reward you with fame, fortune, and family. But let's look at it. Where Joseph is and where he should be. Joseph was in a pagan kingdom. He should be in the house of the patriarch. Joseph was serving a pagan king. He should be serving the patriarch Jacob. His master was a pagan who is worshipped as a pagan god. Joseph had a pagan wealth given by his pagan master, a signet ring, a fine linen, a gold chain, not the patriarch's gift, which is a multicolored coat. So Joseph was in the wrong land, serving the wrong leader of the wrong nation. Joseph was being worshipped, bowed down like a pagan god, instead of being adored by the patriarchs. Joseph had a pagan identity instead of his patriarch's name. He was called Zephaniah Pane. I mean, it's not uncommon to have your changed name, Abraham to Abraham, Sarah to Sarai, Jacob to Israel. But note, all the name change was given by God, not by a false god named Pharaoh. Jacob had a pagan wife instead of a patriarch's provision. Remember from Abraham, he told his servant, ensure that you will get a wife who is not a Canaanite. Same happened to Jacob, to Isaac. But in the case of Jacob, he breaks traditions and marries a priest, a pagan priest child. I mean, from that perspective, how can that be the big payoff? He's farthest from where he should be. But we see this story as worldly success, right? That we are to hope for and desire for. But Moses wants to remind us, this is not where Joseph belongs. This is not the big payoff for your faithfulness. This portion of the narrative is meant not to give us hope, but exists to give us pause, to think. This is not the point of the passage. The story is about the redemptive plan of God. The story is not about Joseph. The first glimmer of hope comes when God blesses Joseph with 2 children. Verse 50. Now before the year of famine came, the 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. So Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh. For he said, God has made me forget all my troubles and all my father's household. He named his second Ephraim. For he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. This is the point. Joseph still wanted to identify himself with the people of God. He still wanted to be identified with the land, the sea, and the covenant. As a slave, he had no choice on what name he would have. Especially if the one who gave you the name was Pharaoh. But to his kids, he had a choice to give a name. He could have easily embraced the Egyptian culture given how much Egypt has been good to him and give his kids Egyptian name. No, Joseph's master was an Egyptian. Joseph's wife was an Egyptian. Joseph's in-law was Egyptian. His whole world was Egyptian. For all intents and purposes, Joseph was an Egyptian. But he chose to identify himself with his Hebrew family. He wanted to show his allegiance to his father. I mean, people ask, why did you name these people Hebrew? That's strange, right? But given the chance to show his identity, he decided to identify himself with the covenant people, the Hebrew people. The second name was Manasseh. God has made me forget all my troubles and all my father's household. I mean, it's not easy to erase from our minds past hurts. But Joseph, by the power of God, was able to erase the past hurts and difficulties. It is God alone who can take out the bitterness, the resentment, the hatred towards other people. His brothers, right? His brothers wanted to kill him. And God was able to take out that bitterness and hurt. God gave Joseph the grace to forget or to erase that hurt and use that for his glory. I mean, the fact that Joseph decided to give his child a Hebrew name, as I mentioned, was a sign that he wanted to align himself with the covenant people. Verse Ephraim, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Here, Joseph rejected Egypt and all that it has brought him. I mean, Egypt gave him what? Fine clothes, fine jewelry, chariots, house, spouse at his disposal. He was living an opulent, wealthy life. Yet, what does he call it? It was the land of affliction. Despite all the benefits, it was still the land of affliction. he identified himself as a Hebrew among Egyptians. Joseph identified himself with the covenant people. He was a Hebrew servant of Yahweh. He rather be identified with Israel, the shepherd, than Pharaoh, the king of the world. He identified with the land of promise, not the land of prosperity, Egypt. He could have easily identified as an Egyptian. He spoke the language, he knew the customs. But deep down in his heart, he was a Hebrew, seeking the promises of God to his covenant people. By these names, Joseph showed his longing for the land and his longing for the covenant. Verse 53. When the 7 years of plenty, which has been in the land of Egypt, came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said, then there was a famine in all the land, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, whatever he says to you, you shall do. God promised food. How? Through fruit, through seed-bearing fruits. But the problem now is the land is not producing the seed-bearing fruit. But there was still seed because of that Hebrew slave. That's why Egypt will survive. But was this plan only for Egypt? Verse 56 to 57 answers that. When the famine spread over all the face of the earth, then Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptian, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. The people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the earth. The plan was not only for Egypt. The plan was primary for the Hebrew people. 20 years prior to this event, God knew there will be a famine. God knew that the people will die of starvation if nothing is done. God knew that Egypt has enough storehouses to store the grains. It was God who sent Joseph a dream which became the match that lit the haystack. It was God who saw to it the land, the house where Joseph will land, will be the house of Potiphar. God orchestrated the imprisonment of the cupbearers and the bread makers. It was God also who placed a dream to the cupbearer and the bread maker. It was God also that enabled Joseph to interpret that dream. It is God also who gave a dream to Pharaoh. And it's God also who gave the ability to Joseph to interpret that dream, making him favorable in the sight of Pharaoh, promoting him to the highest position, so that what? So that the seed will be protected. In short, God sent Joseph to Egypt not for him to become rich and powerful. He sent Joseph to Egypt in order to preserve the promised seed and ensure the salvation of God's people. And while in Egypt, Joseph never forgot who he was and what he was supposed to do. it could be so easy to fall into being Egyptians. It's so easy for us to be drawn with the pleasures of this world and forget the very purpose why we are in this world. The story is not about the success, but his desire to still be associated with the land, the seed, and the covenant. It's not a story of Joseph. It's the story of the redemptive history of God. How God is able and is working around us to fulfill His plan to save mankind. And in the midst of this destruction of this world, pain, fortunes, we are not to forget our purpose in life. Sometimes we are so hand up with the troubles of this world that we forget our purpose, why we are in this world. Mind you, these troubles that we encounter in the world is part of the plan of God to draw people to Him. This world, no matter how good it gets, is still the land of affliction. No amount of wealth, no amount of power, statues, gold, houses, family will be able to rest the spirit of Joseph. He still called it a land of affliction. Because the land that he seeks is the promised land. For us, we have to have that same attitude as Joseph. We should not be sucked in with the trappings of this world, either by the successes that we get or the trials we experience. All of that are secondary to the story. The story of God in your life. Despite all of that success, in the New Testament, the reference of the life of Joseph given by Stephen in Acts never discussed his ascension. It was not a big payoff. It only implied of how Joseph longed for the covenant. That when he was dead, he wanted his body to still be buried in the promised land. That's why he said, this land, no matter how good it is a land of affliction because I'm not meant to live here. Yet we are so engrossed with the here and now, and we are so engrossed into thinking that the life of Joseph is be faithful and God will bless you with all these things. And when God does not, we get disappointed with God and we get angry and point to God, and God, why are you not faithful? The thief comes to kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and might have it abundantly, but not here. Even Abraham said in Hebrews chapter 12, the promised land that was promised to me will be received not in this life, but in the life to come. Despite all the benefits that was given to Joseph in Egypt, his desire and his heart was still with God, longing for his people, longing for the land, longing to be part of the plan in preserving the seed. My desire is that we see this story similarly in our life. That we are not distracted by all the distractions. Lately, in our Bible reading, in our daily Bible reading? We're in Ecclesiastes eh. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Everything is chasing after the wind. All of these things that is happening around us are peripherals. Yet to us, it's the main story. The here and now. May we learn not to be distracted by the activities and the turmoils and the rewards and the suffering of this world. May we fix our eyes on Jesus alone. And may we be faithful in persevering to the very end. Thus says the Lord. Amen. Very last.